So today we're going to talk about the ego as a subjective class. And when we talk about the ego, it's not the dictionary definition of ego, which is vanity or selfishness, or this is more Freud's ego, which is a part of the subjective mind. And it's a very important part. It's a very important part of the subject, as opposed to the superego and the id. The ego is all about image and the surface level. And that's going to be kind of a recurring theme when we're talking about this, as opposed to the superego and the id. It's also about manipulating its environment. So I, as a person, can affect my external environment through certain rational actions, right? And since the ego is the center of subjective control, that's naturally within its domain. It's all about rational manipulation of its environment, of its external reality. It's also about compromising and sort of reconciling its own desires with its external reality, right? External reality that doesn't care about whatever the subject wants. And sort of the job of this part here is to have a transactional relationship with the objective environment in order to fulfill whatever the subject wants. And it's not just about pure desire of the id, it's also about subjectivity. And the ego sort of being the surface level, it's going to be responsible largely for the surface level, the most presentable part of the subject, or the image that the subject most wants to project. So you can see here why that image is very important to the ego, to the extent that it's kind of pretentious to the superego, or it's viewed within the superego as sort of vanity, and it's also pretentious to the id. But taking care of its image and its surface level is a very important part of how the subject sort of reconciles itself to its external reality. Now, as opposed to the superego and the id, right, the ego is not really bound by the limits of these two, which kind of results in a sort of scarcity that makes them unable to compromise and unable to give up whatever the subject is fixated on, right? That's what separates the ego from the rest of the subjective. The important part of the ego is that it's able to let go of certain things, and it understands that it has to compromise in order to get sometimes what it needs or what it wants. So it's not really shackled by the desperation of the id, right? The just pure selfishness and pure survival. That's what the id is. And it's also not shackled by this sense of moral purity, super egotistical sense of the superego. It's not bound by moral idealism in the way that the superego is. And so that puts it in a position to be able to compromise its subjectivity with external reality. So what defines the ego here is that it's the most expressed part of the subjective, which is the part that's the most acceptable or the most presentable. Now, as opposed to the superego, which is the self-critic, the ego is actually the most convinced of its own righteousness. It has to be, so that it can continue with its own selfish actions. So that's going to be the battle between these two, sort of an eternal battle between the self-critic and the ego that believes that it's right, that it's actually morally right. The moral critic versus the part that's actually convinced of its own righteousness. As for the id, it's really too bound by its sense of scarcity and selfishness, and its pure selfishness, to be able to behave in a rational way, in the same way that the ego is, right? If you're just pure selfishness, then it's very low complex. Rationality can't exist within just pure selfishness, right? You have to be able to treat your external environment as an object separate from you or the subjective perception. And specifically for the ego's image here, it's very good at projecting the image of morality or moral cleanliness, rather as opposed to actual morality itself, right? So the superego actually more closely replicates pure morality, while the ego's morality is more image-based, right? More surface-level based, because it knows that it has to project a version of moral purity in order to get along with this external environment. So while the superego is more concerned about actual morality, the ego is more about projecting the image of righteousness, right? So the main takeaway here is that the ego is not shackled by the sort of scarcity of both the superego and the id, or the purest reaction against selfishness. Both of these are very costly and inefficient. And so at least from the perspective of the ego, right? If you're too brazenly selfish, no one's going to want to do business with you. You can't get along with anyone. And of course, having morals is costly. So the ego, being the center of subjective control, is going to be the compromiser. So this sort of intent here is then projected onto collective society. So this actually makes up a collective subject. There's going to be groups of people within an entire collective society that's going to express a dominant trait of either the ego, the id, or the superego. And if we're talking about the ego, this could mean that that person is sort of the center of power, the most rational and manipulative people who are used to affecting and changing their environment and manipulating it for their own advantage, right? You're also going to have the people with the most presentable image. And it's not just about physical image, although that's certainly, they can be very good looking. They have a presentable image. They can also have very good mainstream morals and mainstream values, right? Sort of the center of acceptability. They can have also an acceptable career or a very good-looking family. Their lives are good enough from an aesthetic standpoint to be presented. So you're going to have social media influencers or celebrities. That's a good example of people who express the trait of the ego. So their physical appearance could be presentable. Their morals could be presentable. Their lives or their families and their values can be presentable. That's important to being at the center of attention, right? The ego is all about having the most marketable product, whether it's a soft product or an actual physical product. And also you have politicians and lawyers. So these are the people who basically are skilled enough to market their own intentions, right? Their entire purpose is to sell whatever the subject desires subjectively, and to package it and sell it so that the rest of the collective allows for it, to justify whatever the subject wants in its pure selfishness. And you can see why there's a connection between the surface level and imagery with the manipulation and rationality of the ego, right? Because it knows that it has to take care of its image in order to get what it wants, right? And you can see this class of politicians and lawyers they're all about justifying and rationalizing the subject's pure intent. And so the ego becomes the justifier or the lawyer for the subject's pure intent. You want what you want. Now you have to be able to sell it. You have to be able to finesse it adequately so that they let you have what you want. That's where the lawyer and the politician and the businessman comes in. And all of this is going to affect the morality of the ego. So you can sense a particular flavor of morality that comes with the ego and the ego class within the collective society or the collective subject. So imagine, right, whenever the ego comes into play in your mind or in someone else's mind, so you have this ideal that you decide to compromise away, and that sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, you're able to treat it as an object that you can either have or not have. And so basically now, you're able to treat your idealistic, what was once an idealistic object that you need, now you're able to treat it as an object to be traded away. That's the transactional part of you, the subject, and that's also part of the ego. So what happens is that this here is going to affect their subsequent morality, right? So their morality is going to be influenced by this characteristic here. So let's say you have this thing that you're very passionate or idealistic about, or it's deep within your selfishness, right? Maybe it's religion or politics or race or whatever. That's deeply within the subject's, both the subject's id and superego, right? Because those things bring out both the pure selfish and the pure selfless, right? It's the center of subjectivity. But then the ego part is willing to put that aside for either rational or material purposes, right? To keep the peace, to make money, to gain a particular advantage, or you see a particular mutual advantage that can be gained here if you let go of whatever object if you trade away whatever ideal, right? That would be the ego's rationality in play. So the people who best express the traits of the ego is going to adopt sort of the morality of compromise, right? Live or let live. You do you, right? It's willing to trade away some of its ideals in order to keep for itself. It's all about keeping to itself and preserving a private domain. And it's able to see its ideals and other people's ideals as an object to be negotiated with and traded away for. It's also very concerned about image and the surface level. So how it's seen, how it's perceived, it's going to be very significant to the ego. So if you think of how a particular race or religion is perceived and certain stereotypes that offend the ego, right? Because it's very obsessed with the surface level and anything that affects the perception of any particular group or identity is going to disturb the ego a lot because it wants to keep its image clean. So again, very individualist. This ego here allows for the tolerance of religion and ideology because it's able to see those things such as race, religion, and ideology, or politics as objects. That's isolated from the subjective. So you can see the people who express these traits of the ego are really good at projecting and being convinced of their own sense of righteousness. And also at the same time, they can also get what they want, right? And protect their own interests. As opposed to people who express the id, who are too brazen to be socially acceptable, and the superego who is too burdened and too obsessed with moral purity in order to get what they want and keep their riches as the ego is able to. So the essence of the ego is having it both ways, right? To be able to both project an expressed sense of moral purity, but also being best positioned to get what it desires. So you can think of this duality here as a duality between abundance and scarcity, right? The superego is always eternally criticizing itself, which is a contracting force, right? And the id is just pure selfishness, which is a contracting force as well. The ego expresses the trait of abundance, of being able to affect its environment. And that sort of translates into a class of people within the collective subject. So you can see this layer or aura here that the ego maintains actually convinces itself of its own dishonesty, right? Being dishonest pays. And you can also see how this is so convincing to the point where they can develop a whole morality or moral complex or a replication of the superego that sort of pays tribute to an honest version of selfishness.